Welcome, dear listener, to Driftwood Stories, where cobblestone lanes wander into mist and candlelight flickers behind velvet-curtained windows, where old tales sleep beneath oak roots and tangled ivy, waiting patiently for the moon to rise. Tonight we walk gently into the hush of another world, a world spun from starlight, spun from silence, a story told in whispers and roses, in dreams and in time itself. Let the day fall behind you now. Close your eyes if you wish, or let them drift along the quiet ceiling above, and feel the stillness come, like snow falling on ancient stone. For this is a tale of a sleeping princess, of a spell as soft as winter breath, of a kingdom lost in time, and a boy who walked through thorns not to rescue, but simply to understand. This is the sleeping beauty of Thornvale, and it begins on a night when the stars came just a little closer to the earth. Chapter 1. The Night of Silver Stars. Long ago, in a valley where the wild roses grew thick along the hedgerows and foxes slept beneath the roots of mossy oaks, there stood a quiet kingdom, neither vast nor rich, but peaceful and fair. It was called Thornvale, for the roses and for the thorns, though time would come when people remembered only one or the other. At the heart of Thornvale was a stone castle with grey towers softened by ivy, where lived a king and a queen, kind-hearted, beloved and sorrowful. For many years they had no child. Their halls echoed only with the footsteps of servants, and the queen often stood at her high window, watching the clouds and wondering if the heavens had forgotten her. One spring, as twilight folded over the hills and the stars began to prick through the pale sky, the queen walked alone beside the forest stream. There, in the soft hush of frog song and fern-fringed light, a small green shape hopped to her feet. A frog, with skin like lichen and eyes like amber glass. She would have stepped back, but the creature raised one webbed foot as though in greeting, and then it spoke. Your sorrow is heard, and your hope is not in vain. Before the year turns once more, you shall bear a child, a daughter, bright as spring dawn. Then the frog was gone, vanishing into the ripples like mist. The queen, startled and trembling, returned to the castle. She told no one, not even the king. But when the snows came and melted again, when the hawthorn bloomed white and the bees danced between its branches, the queen's belly had begun to round. And sure enough, on the longest night of the year, as the stars burned low and steady in the frostbitten sky, a child was born. They named her Briar-Rose for the bloom and the thorn, and the way her hair curled like golden vines. The bells rang from the steeple tower for 3 days and 3 nights, and the people of Thornvale rejoiced as though spring itself had returned. Lanterns were strung from branch to branch, and musicians played long into the twilight. Never had the valley known such light, and to bless the child, the king and queen prepared a grand feast. Now in those days, not so very long ago, though far enough, there still lived fairies in the corners of the world. Most folk did not see them, but kings and queens, being old and rooted in older things, remembered, and so the king summoned 12 wise fairies, the most graceful, most ancient of their kind, to come and give their blessings. Golden plates were set for them, and goblets of crystal. The cooks prepared honeyed apples and clove-roasted pears, stews that shimmered with spices, and cakes so light they trembled in the spoon. The 13th fairy, the one not invited, lived far away in a crooked tower of basalt and briar. She was older than the rest, and proud. Long ago she had turned her face from the world and from kindness alike. But more than anything she hated to be forgotten, and so, on the night of the feast, while music played and torches danced along the castle walls, the 13th fairy arrived, uninvited. The hall grew still when she entered. Her gown was deep grey, her eyes as sharp as winter ice, and around her shoulders hung a cloak of twisted branches. The king rose to welcome her with all the grace he could summon, and offered her a seat. But there was no golden plate left, only plain pewter set aside in the kitchen. She took it with a smile that cut. The 12 fairies stepped forward one by one, each offering a blessing. "May she be wise," said the first, touching the child's brow. "May she be kind," said the second. "May her voice be music," said the third. "May her hands bring healing. May her heart be strong. May she know laughter, courage, patience, grace." Each gift was a petal, layered upon the child like the bloom of her name. But when the 11th fairy stepped back, the 13th moved forward. Her voice was like a winter wind scraping glass. "When she turns 15, said the 13th fairy, "the princess shall prick her finger on a spindle and die." A hush fell that no lute nor horn could break. The queen gasped and clutched the child tighter. The king's mouth moved, but no sound came. And then, before the 12th fairy could speak her blessing, the 13th turned, her cloak of branches rustling like dry leaves, and vanished. But all was not lost. The 12th fairy, who had not yet spoken, stepped forward, her eyes full of sorrow and steadiness. She could not undo the curse entirely. Such things were bound deep in the threads of fate. But she could soften it, twist it just slightly, like a vine around a thorn. "She shall not die," said the fairy, "but sleep for 100 years. And at the end of that sleep she shall wake, when love finds her, gentle as dawn." And so it was spoken. The feast ended in silence. The stars above Thornvale shimmered like frost upon velvet, and the cradle was watched more closely than any crown. From that day on, no spindle was allowed within the kingdom. The king sent out guards and smiths, who gathered every spinning wheel, every thread spinner's tool, and cast them into the deepest cavern of the mountain. For years the sound of spinning vanished from the land, but the curse, like winter, does not ask permission, and the rose had already begun to bloom. Chapter 2, Briar-Rose and the Secret Garden. Princess Briar-Rose grew up behind stone walls and velvet curtains, watched over by nursemaids, guards, and whispers. Yet even in such careful quiet, the child was not lonely. She was like a morning bird, bright-eyed, curious, and full of song. The castle itself seemed to lean in close to her laughter. Tapestries swayed gently when she passed, floors did not creak beneath her feet, and fireplaces gave an extra flicker, as though to warm her steps. In every corner she found small enchantments, mice that seemed to bow before scurrying away, ravens that left trinkets on the window ledge, and a harp that sometimes played a note on its own. She was taught the ways of royal life, how to curtsy, how to speak with care, how to read poetry by candlelight and pour tea without a splash. But more than that, she learned to listen. She listened to wind through the arrow slits, to footsteps in the empty chapel, to the hush of books never opened, and sometimes, when the moon hung low and her thoughts grew still, she heard a voice in her dreams, soft as moss and just as ancient. It sang without words, a lullaby in a language no one had taught her, and always there was a forest in those dreams, deep, dappled and full of golden thorns that did not cut her. She would wake from such dreams with her fingers twitching as though reaching for something just out of sight. One of her nursemaids, a quiet woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes like river stones, often stayed beside her bed after such nights. She said little, but her hands were warm, and her humming matched the melody from the dreams. What Briar-Rose did not know, and could not have guessed, was that this nursemaid was the 12th fairy, now hidden in plain sight, keeping silent watch over the child she had tried to save. The king and queen, though devoted, grew cautious with time. The memory of the curse had faded for some, but for them it was etched into every hallway. They forbade spinning wheels, spindles, even sewing needles in the upper rooms. Briar-Rose was told to leave alone anything sharp, though no one ever told her why. "Just be safe, darling," the queen would murmur, brushing her hair with fingers that trembled slightly. "Promise you'll be safe." "I promise," Briar-Rose would reply, though she didn't know what danger she promised to avoid. Yet safety can be a lonely thing. As she entered her 12th and 13th years, the castle grew smaller around her. The guards always bowed, but never let her wander too far. The other girls in the village were strangers, seen only through high windows, and though she loved the walled gardens, where rosemary curled through the hedges and nightingales sang from iron trellises, she longed for something more, something beyond the gate. One morning, after a long night of the thorn forest dream, Briar-Rose wandered deeper into the garden than usual. The sky was pale with early mist, and dew clung to her slippers. She passed through the rose arbour, beneath ivy-wrapped statues, and came to a part of the wall she had never seen. There was a door, small, wooden, half covered in moss, with a rusted keyhole shaped like a teardrop. It should have been locked. It always had been, but today the door was slightly ajar. She glanced around. No one in sight. The robins watched from the branches but said nothing. She pushed the door open. On the other side was a garden even older than the first, untamed, silent and wild with tangled vines. Apple trees leaned over cracked stones. A fountain, dry for years, still held the faint scent of mint, and in the centre, nestled among violet blooms, stood a low stone bench, worn smooth by time. There she found a little book, leather-bound, no larger than her hand. It was full of poems, not in the language of the kingdom, but in the tongue of her dreams. She sat down, and for the first time read them aloud. The air stirred, the leaves rustled in rhythm. Somewhere beneath the soil, something listened. That day became the first of many. She returned to the secret garden whenever she could, always when the mist still kissed the ground, always alone. There she read, dreamed, and hummed to the unseen voice that sometimes answered. And still the years passed. Her 14th birthday arrived with bells and feasting. She wore a gown the colour of bluebells, and the Queen smiled despite her eyes. The King gave her a locket of carved rosewood, and in the evening fireworks glittered above the towers like stars that had come down to dance. But the day after the celebration, the Queen wept in the chapel. The King walked the ramparts all night, and the fairy nursemaid, alone in her narrow room, lit a single candle and whispered a spell of protection around the sleeping corridors. For they all knew the 15th year had begun, and the spindle waited in the shadow of some forgotten stair. Chapter 3. The Turning of the Wheel. The morning of Briar-Rose's 15th birthday dawned soft and silver. Rain had fallen gently in the night, leaving the rooftops damp and gleaming. Bells chimed across Thornvale, low and slow, as though they too had just awakened from some long sleep. Inside the castle, garlands hung from the banisters, and sweet rolls steamed on the sideboards. Minstrels tuned their lutes in the solar, but despite the colour and light, the mood was quiet, as if the stone itself remembered something the people tried to forget. Briar-Rose rose early. She had slept well. No strange dreams, no singing forest, only the soft hush of rain on shutters. She was older now, she thought, though she did not feel different. Still, a pull tugged gently behind her ribs. Not fear, not quite, just a turning. She dressed in her favourite gown, soft green, with tiny gold leaves embroidered along the sleeves, and slipped from her room before the courtiers came with gifts and platitudes. She did not go to the garden, not today. Instead, she walked the castle's oldest hallways. Some part of her had always wondered what lay beyond the familiar corridors. She had never seen the western wing, never climbed the back stair, never touched the doors behind the tapestry of the weeping stag. Today the castle seemed to lean toward her, yielding its secrets not all at once, but petal by petal. She passed under archways dim with dust, stepped over stones worn smooth by forgotten feet. The air grew cooler, older. It smelled of time. Eventually, she came to a narrow stair, spiralling upward. The wood was dark, the banister carved with acorns and oak leaves. No one had polished it in years. She placed one hand on the rail and began to climb. The stair turned and turned, a snail's shell winding into the tower's hollow heart. Light spilled from a single slit in the stone, dust motes dancing like tiny stars. And at the very top, a door, wooden, simple, closed but not locked. She knocked once, no answer. She opened it. Inside, the room was small and circular, filled with shafts of light and the quiet rhythm of turning. An old woman sat hunched at a spindle, her foot working the treadle, her hands feeding wool into the twisting thread. She looked up, blinked and smiled, not cruelly, not sweetly, simply surprised. "Well now," she said in a voice like dry paper, "a visitor. Been an age since I've had one?" Briar-Rose stepped in, drawn forward by the strange device. the soft hum of it spinning. "What is it you're doing?" she asked. "Spinning," said the woman. "Thread from fleece. All the old ways are dying, child. Few know this craft any more." Briar-Rose reached out. The spindle gleamed, gold polished smooth by years of turning. "May I try?" The woman only nodded. Briar-Rose sat. Her fingers brushed the wall. And then the prick, so small it hardly hurt. A sharp whisper of pain. A single drop of blood bloomed on her fingertip. She blinked. The room seemed to tilt. The light flickered, then dimmed. The old woman stood, her mouth open as if to speak, but her words were lost in the hush that followed. Briar-Rose swayed once, then crumpled gently to the floor. A curse had come, and it spread, silently like mist down a mountain. Below, the nursemaid dropped her teacup in the corridor. In the kitchens, the cook leaned on her ladle and closed her eyes. The guards at the gate sat down, their swords slipping gently from their hands. Even the fire in the great hearth fluttered once and stilled. All through the castle, time gave a long sigh and curled into sleep. The queen, midway through a prayer, knelt where she was and did not rise. The king, eyes fixed on the horizon from the tower, fell still as the stone beneath his feet. And in the high room above the winding stair, Briar-Rose lay motionless, her golden curls spread like a halo, her fingers still marked with a single perfect bead of red. But she did not die. She dreamed. She dreamed of forest paths and old songs, of thorns that opened to her steps, and a voice, familiar now, calling her name, not with urgency, but with love. Outside the castle, vines began to grow. Roses, white and pink and deep crimson, crept over the stone, curling around arches, climbing up towers, weaving through the iron gates. Thorns followed, thick as a man's wrist, sharp as regret, and Thornvale, once bright and proud, disappeared from the world, swallowed by the briar. The story passed into rumour, then into legend, then for a long while into nothing at all, until the right ears heard it once more. Chapter 4. The Enchanted Sleep. The castle stood silent. The wind moved gently through its stone arches, whispering lullabies no one heard. Dust lay undisturbed on silk cushions and golden sconces. The great hall, once filled with music and light, now held only the slow drip of water from the roof tiles and the patient creak of time. Briar-Rose slept in her high tower, beneath a blanket the colour of clouds before dawn. Her face was still, peaceful, as if she were listening to something far away, something soft and long remembered. She did not age. Her hair did not grey, nor did her skin pale. Her breath was slow and deep, steady as tide and moon. Around her, the entire court slept with her. The cook, arms folded on her kneading board, dreamt of warm pastries and morning laughter. The jester, curled on a stair, murmured half a rhyme in his sleep. The knights in the guardroom, the chambermaids in their nests of linens, the librarian slumped at his desk, all of them drifted in that same still sea. Even the fire in the hearth seemed caught mid-flicker, golden tongues paused mid-leap, and outside the roses grew. They twisted up the outer walls, thick and wild and without end. Their blossoms opened with the seasons and never fell, thorn after thorn after thorn. Years passed, decades. The story of the sleeping kingdom was carried on the wind by wandering minstrels and shepherds who had seen strange blooms at the forest's edge. Most thought it a fable, an enchanted castle, they scoffed, laughing over mugs of cider. A girl who never wakes? Nonsense, just a tale to keep children from the woods. But some, the old ones, the quiet ones, believed. They said the castle was hidden in a tangle of briars that no blade could cut, that every year some foolish youth ventured in and was never seen again. They said the roses had a memory, that they whispered to each other in dreams. No one had seen the king or queen in 100 years. No trade came from the valley. No rider passed the village gate. But in the deep of winter, when the frost was thick and stars pressed low to the earth, some still claimed to hear music, very faint, from beyond the trees. A waltz with no dancers, a lullaby for no child. The forest grew dense around Thornvale, feeding on forgetfulness. Birds flew over but never landed. Deer passed the outer trees and turned away. Even wolves gave the place a wide berth. And still the castle waited, not in sadness, not in despair, but in something deeper, the rest of hope, the kind that does not rush, the kind that knows all things have their season. In the highest tower, Briar-Rose dreamed, sometimes of her garden, now long overgrown, sometimes of her mother's voice, reading poetry, sometimes of a boy she had never met, standing at the edge of the wood, listening. She did not fear the thorns. She knew, somehow, they were not her prison. They were her protection. One day, far from Thornvale, far from anything that remembered its name, a boy sat beside a river, turning a small piece of carved wood over in his hands. He didn't know why he had found it or why he carried it. He only knew that each night he dreamt of a girl in a room full of roses, waiting, not for rescue, not for glory, just waiting. And when the morning mist lifted, he stood, tucked the wood into his coat, and began to walk toward the trees. Chapter 5. The Boy from Nowhere. He was not a prince. He had no title, no banner stitched with lions or stars. He came from no grand hall or noble line, but from a crooked cottage near the edge of a half-forgotten village, where the chimney leaned and the fire smoked sideways in the rain. His name was Emrys, though no one used it much. Most called him boy or lad or you there. He was apprenticed to a woodcutter, a kind man with a stiff knee and a love of silence. Emrys was quiet too. He had no brothers, no sisters, and no one who asked where he went when the chores were done. So he wandered into the trees, along the old deer trails, down to the river where silver fish flickered and vanished like ghosts, and sometimes he listened. There were days when the forest felt like it was speaking, not in words, but in impressions. A hush beneath a certain tree, a warmth in the stone when he stepped off the path, a low, almost musical pull from the east. The old woman in the village, the one with eyes like ash and a voice like rust, at once told him a story. Beyond the forest, she'd said, poking at her hearth, there's a castle wrapped in thorns, a whole kingdom sleeping. been so for 100 years or more. He hadn't laughed as others had. "Why?" he'd asked. She had paused, as if surprised by the question. A curse, a girl, a promise, that was all she said. But from that day on, Emery's dreamed differently, not just of trees and rivers, but of roses, vast and tangled, of towers rimmed with ivy, of a room with no breath but full of light. And always a girl. He did not know her name, but he knew her presence, like a note in a forgotten song, like the part of himself he'd always known but never met. One morning, as mist coiled through the hollows and crows circled high, Emery's took a satchel, a cloak, and the carved scrap of rosewood he'd found months earlier beneath a fallen log, a shape that felt somehow familiar in his hands. He did not tell the woodcutter where he was going. He did not know himself, only that something, someone, was calling. He walked for days through tangled glades and thistle-choked fields. He crossed streams with no name and followed the sun when it showed, the moss when it didn't. The deeper he went, the quieter the forest became, not with fear, but with reverence. Birdsong faded, wind softened, even his own footsteps seemed to hush. Then one evening the trees opened into a clearing, wide, still, and utterly silent. There before him stood a wall of roses, not like garden roses. These were wild and ancient, thick with thorn, tall as towers, pulsing faintly in the dusk. They twisted into one another like vines grown from memory and dream. The castle lay hidden beyond. He could see only the faintest outline, a spire here, a rooftop there, as if the structure itself had become part of the briar. He stepped forward. The thorns should have torn him, but they parted, quietly, almost politely, as though they had been waiting. He walked between them, deeper, deeper. The roses closed silently behind him, sealing off the world. Inside the thorn wall it was dusk, no matter the hour. The air shimmered with stillness. Moss grew over stone lions at the gate. A fountain stood frozen mid-splash. Ivy blanketed everything, but here and there windows remained whole. Lights flickered behind none of them. The great doors of the castle hung slightly open. He pushed one with both hands. It groaned. Inside, time slept. He wandered the corridors, past figures frozen in slumber, a steward at his desk, a maid with folded linens, a dog curled before the hearth. Their breathing was slow, imperceptible. The air was cool and golden, as though a century of candlelight still lingered. He climbed the staircase. He didn't know why, only that he must. Floor by floor, turning corridor by turning corridor, the air grew lighter, thinner, and at last he came to a narrow door, half covered in dust, half open to the waiting light. Inside, the room was filled with roses. They bloomed from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. They bloomed from the cracks in the stone. And in the centre, on a bed carved with vines, lay the girl from his dreams. Her hair fanned like sunlit silk. Her hands were folded gently, as though in thought, not prayer. Her lips were faintly parted, as though she were about to speak. He stepped forward, not with haste, but with reverence. He sat beside her and took the little scrap of rosewood from his coat. he placed it in her hand, and then, only then, did he lean down and kiss her. Not a kiss to claim, not to awaken, a kiss of recognition, of return, of yes, it's you. Chapter 6, The Room with No Breath. Time held its breath. The kiss passed like a whisper between them. Not sudden, not loud, but soft and inevitable, like the moment before snowfall. And then a change, barely perceptible, but there. The roses shivered, not as if touched by wind, but as if remembering movement. The light in the room brightened, not from the sun, but from some ancient joy awakening in the stone itself. Emrys drew back and looked. Briar-Rose lay still, but her fingers stirred. Slowly, slowly they moved, one, then the other. Her breath deepened once, then again. A tremor passed through her lashes, and then her eyes opened. They were not startled. They were not wide with fear or confusion. They simply opened as if waking from an ordinary nap, as though this moment had been waiting on the edge of her dream all along. She looked at him and smiled. "You came," she said softly. Emrys did not ask how she knew him. He only nodded, a little dazed. "I dreamed of you," she added, still holding the carved rosewood he'd given her. "And I of you," he replied. The spell, at last, was undone, but it did not shatter. It melted, like frost under morning sun, like candle wax softening, like silence yielding to song. All through the castle, people began to stir. The cook in the kitchen blinked at her bread, confused as to why it had not risen. The dogs barked once, yawned, and went back to their paws. The Queen, still kneeling in the chapel, rose slowly and looked to the window. The King turned from the tower, hand still on the stone ledge, blinking as though the landscape had changed. And in a way, it had. The fairies, wherever they had hidden themselves, each felt the moment arrive. The youngest, the 12th, smiled where she stood in a corridor full of spiderwebs, her task complete. Outside, the thorns began to recede. They did not wither. They did not die. They simply unwound, curling backward like ribbon, returning to earth, stone and story. Roses fell like petals in a breeze. Light poured through long-shuttered windows. Emrys helped Briar-Rose to her feet. Her legs trembled, not from fear, but from too much stillness. She laughed once, the smallest, clearest sound. They walked slowly through the tower, down the steps where dust no longer clung, and as they stepped into the corridor, servants blinked at them with tears in their eyes and joy in their hearts, though not one could say why. The princess had awakened, but not just her. The kingdom had awakened. The villagers, seeing the castle from afar, no longer hidden in thorn or haze, gasped and pointed. Bells were rung, not from duty, but from delight, and those who had never believed the tale were the first to shout its truth. There was no great parade, no royal proclamation, only a quiet reunion in the hall. The Queen gathered her daughter into her arms and did not speak for a long time. The King laid one hand on Emrys's shoulder and nodded, not as ruler to subject, but as one soul to another. And Thornvale, forgotten and sleeping for 100 years, began again. Chapter 7, The Kingdom That Woke extended. The first full day of waking came quietly. Sunlight filtered through windows sealed for a century. Dust drifted like snow through golden beams. Doors creaked open, not with dread, but with wonder. In the courtyard, the old fig tree, which had somehow survived 100 silent winters, began to bloom. Birds nested in its branches within hours, and bees arrived as though summoned by memory. Inside, the castle moved like a dream unspooling in reverse. The steward, upon finding the ink in his inkwell still wet, wept into his sleeve. The seamstress, seeing her needles exactly where she'd left them, laughed until tears filled her thimble. A page boy tripped over his own feet in joy, though he hadn't remembered he was a page boy until someone called his name. Time, strange as it was, had been kind, and in the very heart of it all stood Briar-Rose. She moved through her castle with bare feet and a soft smile, touching the velvet curtains, the marble balustrades, the portraits whose eyes had watched over her slumber. She did not rush. Every corner she passed seemed to sigh, as if the stone itself had waited for her return. But she had not returned. She had simply become. The girl who had dreamed of forest paths and silent lullabies was now something more. There was a stillness to her now, but also a strength, the kind that comes from having waited, from having dreamed in darkness and not been afraid. The king and queen looked at her as if she were both child and miracle. The queen, who had prayed at her cradle and at her side, now held her hand, not in fear, but in reverence. The king, whose crown had gathered dust atop his throne, placed it back upon his head, but looser now, lighter. He had not ruled for 100 years, and yet, in that pause, he had become a better ruler than all the ones who had never stopped speaking. And Emrys, the boy from nowhere, the boy with no sword, no bloodline, no claim, walked at her side, not behind. He met every glance with calm eyes. When courtiers whispered of propriety, of protocols and bloodlines, the queen simply looked at them and said, "He woke a kingdom not with might, but with kindness. What more royal thing is there? No grand wedding was announced. There were no royal decrees. Instead, Briar-Rose and Emrys planted a tree in the castle garden, a rose tree, old and thorned but blooming freely. It was not to mark their betrothal, but their beginning, and the people of Thornvale followed their example. They did not rebuild the castle walls taller or grander. They opened new gates instead. They built glass houses for the roses and planted orchards in the village commons. They took what had been asleep, not only in the castle, but in their own hearts, and woke it gently. Children born after the waking were given names from the old tales: Lyra, Tom, Rosewin, Em. They grew up hearing not only of a princess who had slept for 100 years, but of a valley that had chosen, finally, to rest. And to wake kindly. Briar-Rose did not vanish into myth. She walked the markets. She told stories to children beneath the fig tree. She sang lullabies from her dreams in the winter hall, and no one asked where she'd learned them, only to hear them again. And Emrys built her a small wooden room at the top of the old west tower, open to the sky. There, she wrote, not history, not legend, just thoughts, just wonderings, just dreams. The fairies, never seen again in full daylight, were not forgotten. Their names were spoken at births in blessing. A candle was always left at the chapel window on the eve of the solstice. And sometimes, when the roses bloomed too early or out of season, people simply smiled and said, "They remember." And so it was that Thornvale, the kingdom that had once vanished into sleep, became not a place of sorrow, but of peace. The thorns were never feared again. They were tended gently by gardeners who spoke to them as old friends. And the story of the Sleeping Beauty was not told as a warning, but as a reminder. That rest is not weakness, that stillness is not death, that even the longest sleep is not the end, if love is willing to wait. And if you walk the edge of the forest at dusk, when the air is full of the hush before stars, you might just hear the sound of her voice. Soft as rose petals, strong as time, telling stories to those who need them most. Not of heroes and battles, but of a girl who dreamed, a boy who listened, and a kingdom that woke.